Have you ever wondered if the greatest threat to humanity wasn't a flood, but being so powerful they almost wiped us out before it ever began? It sounds like the plot of a science fiction novel, yet this is rooted in one of the oldest stories ever told, the story of the Nephilim, giants mentioned briefly in the Bible but described in vivid detail in other ancient writings. In the beginning of Genesis, amid the growing troubles of early humankind, a strange phrase appears. It speaks of the sons of God seeing the daughters of men, and from their union, a generation of extraordinary beings arose. These beings are called the Nephilim, translating roughly as the fallen ones. But what does that mean? Fallen in what sense? Fallen from grace, from heaven, or fallen into corruption? And did these beings, whose legend looms larger the deeper you look, nearly bring humanity to the brink of extinction before the flood? This short passage sparks endless questions. Were they simply powerful warriors, or something more? A blending of divine and human that disrupted the natural order. Scholars and storytellers have argued over the centuries whether the Nephilim were real giants, mythic symbols, or theological warnings. Their story touches on deep ideas about human nature, judgment, and the mysterious dangers of forbidden knowledge. As the story unfolds, a more detailed picture emerges not in the book of Genesis, but in an ancient text called the Book of Enoch. That book describes angels called Watchers, who descended to earth, saw human women, and crossed the boundaries between their realm and ours. The offspring of these unions were giants, creatures so powerful they consumed the earth's resources and turned on humankind, leading to chaos. In that telling, the world had to be flooded to make way for a new beginning. This raises a key question. Were the Nephilim simply a foreshadowing of humanity's failures, or were they a literal threat, a corrupted form of life so strong that they nearly destroyed everything? Their story echoes through time, emerging in fragments in apocryphal texts like the Book of Giants, and even in modern evenings whispering of lost giants and ancient secrets. In every telling, they are more than large people. They are a warning, a myth, a theological puzzle, a touch point for our fears about crossing lines we were never meant to cross. Today, their name still stirs imaginations. What if the Nephilim were real? What if forbidden knowledge can still corrupt our future? Whether you see them as legend or warning, their story demands attention. And so now, we begin, step by step, to trace who these beings were, how they were portrayed in ancient texts, what meaning they carried, and what that means for us, thousands of years later. Genesis tells us simply that, when people began to multiply on the face of the earth, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then, it adds that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and afterward, those were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. What lies behind that language, and why does it matter? The text itself gives us just a few lines, but they are heavy with meaning and mystery. Scholars have long studied the phrase, sons of God, in Hebrew, Bnei Elohim. In other passages, such as Job, that phrase clearly refers to angelic beings standing before God's court. One of the oldest interpretations takes that meaning almost at face value. It sees those sons of God as fallen angels who, drawn to human women, crossed boundaries they were never meant to cross, and produced offspring, these monstrous, powerful beings known as the Nephilim. That view is echoed in ancient texts like the Book of Enoch, and other writings outside the Bible that made their way into early Jewish and Christian traditions. But not everyone agrees. Another interpretation reads sons of God as a reference to the descendants of Seth, the godly son of Adam, while daughters of men represent the ungodly line descending from Cain. In that view, the Nephilim were simply corrupt offspring of moral decline, mighty in name, but reflecting the breakdown of character rather than a supernatural origin. Still, a third explanation sees sons of God not as literal angels or descendants of Seth, but rather as powerful kings or leaders, perhaps rulers who claimed divine status in ancient Near Eastern culture. Their marriages with ordinary women, then, would symbolize oppression or exploitation, producing offspring viewed as extraordinary, not by birth but by social or political reputation. Such varying interpretations show how open the text is and how readers bring their own world or tradition to it. Some see mythic invasion, some see moral degeneration, and others see social critique. Yet what unites these readings is the sense of overwhelming power. Whether these giants came from rebellious angels, intermarriage between moral and immoral lines, or dynastic rulers, they were seen as striking figures. Mighty men of old, men of renown, and they appear again after the flood, when Israel's spies encounter them in Canaan and say that confronting them made them feel like grasshoppers. That says something about how enduring their reputation was, even centuries later. The meaning of the Hebrew term Nephilim itself adds another layer. It may derive from the verb naphal, meaning to fall, thus the fallen ones. But scholars also consider interpretations like those who cause others to fall, or fallen in battle, perhaps violent or dangerous warriors. Ancient translations reflect this ambiguity too. The Septuagint and Vulgate tend to render them as giants, while other versions use terms like violent ones, or an outright transliteration, leaving it open to interpretation. Even within Scripture, the Nephilim's brief mention echoes far beyond Genesis. Numbers reports that the spies saw them in Canaan and trembled. Ezekiel may reference them metaphorically as fallen warriors. Yet Genesis never says explicitly that the Nephilim were evil, or that they brought about the flood. It simply places them in the narrative context that directly precedes the story of Noah. That proximity may be enough to link them in the mind of the reader as part of a world fallen into corruption, but it leaves room for much interpretation. So why does this biblical fragment inspire such debate? Perhaps because it opens the door to the question of boundaries between divine and human, strength and morality, ancient myth and everyday life. Whether we see Nephilim as mythic giants sprung of angelic rebellion, or as symbolic figures representing societal decay, their mention asks us to consider the consequences of transgressing limits, those imposed by nature, by God, or by society. As we move beyond the brief biblical references, the story of the Nephilim begins to take shape in other writings, and it is here that we start to see how their identity was understood in ancient times. The Bible itself does not give us long descriptions of who they were, what they looked like, or how they lived. Instead, it leaves us with just the term Nephilim, a word that itself has raised as many questions as answers. The Hebrew root nephal means to fall, and from that many conclude that Nephilim must mean the fallen ones. But fallen in what sense? Were they beings cast down from heaven, suggesting angelic origins? Or were they warriors who had fallen in battle, remembered for their size and strength? Another interpretation is that they were those who caused others to fall, a way of describing violent oppressors whose power led to destruction. Ancient translations reflect this ambiguity. When Hebrew texts were translated into Greek, the word became gigantes, which in English gives us the familiar word giant. This has shaped how most people understand the Nephilim, as massive, towering beings whose physical size set them apart from ordinary humans. Later, in the Latin Vulgate, the word was left transliterated rather than translated, preserving the mystery but also ensuring that the term Nephilim carried with it a sense of uniqueness. Over time, these variations helped build a tradition where the Nephilim could be imagined as both giants in stature and fallen in nature. It is in the Book of Enoch, however, that the Nephilim come into sharp focus. This ancient Jewish text, not included in the standard biblical canon but widely circulated in early centuries, expands the short Genesis account into a detailed story. Here, the sons of God are no longer an ambiguous phrase open to multiple interpretations. They are clearly angels, specifically a group called the Watchers, who were tasked with watching over humanity. According to the narrative, the Watchers descended from heaven to earth, drawn by desire for human women. They swore an oath together, binding themselves to this act of rebellion, and took wives for themselves. From these unions, the Nephilim were born. The text describes these offspring in striking terms. They were giants of immense size, sometimes said to reach 300 cubits, a figure more symbolic than literal, since it would make them impossibly large. Their power was not only physical, they also embodied corruption. The Book of Enoch says that the giants turned against humanity, consuming all the food that humans could produce, and when that was not enough, they turned to devouring flesh and spreading violence across the earth. The image is one of unchecked appetite and destructive dominance, a distorted blending of heavenly power with human vulnerability that destabilized the world itself. The Watchers, meanwhile, did more than break the boundary of heaven and earth. They also shared forbidden knowledge with humankind. Some taught metalworking and weapon-making, giving humans tools of war. Others revealed secrets of magic, cosmetics, or astrology, practices that in this tradition were not seen as cultural achievements, but as corrupting forces. What should have been hidden knowledge was now freely given, and in the worldview of this text, that knowledge only served to amplify human sin and accelerate destruction. The presence of the Nephilim, therefore, represented more than just physical threat. They embodied a broader theme. When the divine order is disrupted, chaos follows. Their existence was itself a violation of boundaries, and their actions multiplied corruption until the world was filled with violence. The Book of Enoch makes clear that this corruption is the backdrop for the flood. It was not simply that humanity had become wicked, but that the very fabric of creation had been disrupted by these hybrid beings and the forbidden teachings of their angelic fathers. The flood, in that telling, was not only judgment on humanity, but also a cleansing act to rid the earth of the giants and the Watchers who brought them into being. This way of telling the story is important because it shows how early readers tried to answer questions left open by Genesis. Who were the Nephilim? Why were they such a problem? How did their existence connect to the decision to send a flood? In Enoch, we see an attempt to weave those threads into a coherent explanation. The Nephilim were giants born of rebellious angels. They corrupted the earth, and God's judgment was the only way to restore order. The Book of Enoch had wide influence, especially in Jewish thought around the time of the Second Temple, and among early Christians. In fact, fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, showing that it was read and valued in communities like Qumran. Some early church fathers also took its account seriously. Over time, though, it was excluded from the biblical canon in most traditions, surviving fully only in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Its exclusion did not erase its impact, however. It provided the foundation for how many people have thought about the Nephilim, not just as mysterious figures, but as the direct product of an otherworldly rebellion. What makes this expansion so compelling is the way it humanizes the story. The Watchers are not distant gods, but angels who see, desire, and choose. The Nephilim are not merely names in a genealogy, but creatures whose hunger and violence devastate the world. And humans are not simply passive bystanders. They are drawn into corruption by the very knowledge given to them. It paints a picture where the Nephilim are part of a chain reaction that explains why the world was seen as beyond repair. And yet, the story of the Nephilim does not end with the flood. Genesis itself notes that they were present in those days, and also afterward. Later biblical texts mention them again in the context of the land of Canaan, where Israel's spies report seeing people so tall and powerful that they seemed like grasshoppers in comparison. The memory of giants did not disappear with Noah's Ark. Instead, it remained alive in the imagination of later generations, suggesting that even if the flood was meant to cleanse the earth, traces of that corruption lingered. When we put all of this together, we see why the word Nephilim continues to capture imagination. It carries with it layers of meaning: fallen, giant, violent, corrupted. It stands at the crossroads of heaven and earth, myth and history, human and divine. And it raises enduring questions. Were the Nephilim literal beings or symbols of human corruption? Were they reminders of how fragile boundaries are between good and evil, or stories meant to warn against stepping outside of what is permitted? What is certain is that the Nephilim were remembered as a force that changed the course of the world. Whether by their strength, their violence, or their very existence, they contributed to a world so broken that it had to be remade. And that is why their story continues to matter. If the Book of Enoch gave us the most vivid description of the Nephilim, another ancient work, the Book of Giants, adds even more detail to their story. Unlike Genesis, which gives us only a few verses, and unlike Enoch, which focuses on the rebellion of the angels and their forbidden knowledge, the Book of Giants centers almost entirely on the Nephilim themselves. It is a fragmented text, surviving in pieces from the Dead Sea Scrolls and in later Manichaean writings. But even in its incomplete form, it provides a striking look at how ancient people imagined these giants. The fragments discovered at Qumran show us that this book was popular among the same Jewish communities that valued the Book of Enoch. It tells of the giants as individuals with names, personalities, and dreams, unlike Genesis, which simply calls them mighty men of old. Here they are living characters whose actions drive the story forward. Giants such as Ohia, Hahia, and Mahaway appear, each representing different aspects of the Nephilim identity. These names are strange to modern ears, but they remind us that the giants were once seen as more than faceless monsters. They had stories, and those stories reflected the fear and awe people felt toward them. One of the most memorable features of the Book of Giants is the description of the giants' dreams. In the text, the Nephilim experience troubling visions that seem to foreshadow their own destruction. Some dream of the entire world being covered by water, an image clearly connected to the coming flood. Others dream of being cut down or reduced to nothing. These dreams disturb them so deeply that they seek out interpretation, trying to understand what fate awaits them. In this way, the giants are portrayed almost like tragic figures, aware, at least dimly, that their existence has no lasting future. The Book of Giants also shows the giants interacting with their angelic fathers. The Watchers, who had descended from heaven and taken human wives, are portrayed as still connected to their children. But even they cannot prevent what is coming. In some versions, the giants send messengers to the Watchers, asking for help in interpreting their dreams and hoping for deliverance. The replies they receive, however, confirm that judgment is inevitable. Their corruption has gone too far, and the flood will soon wash them away. These fragments reveal something important about how ancient communities understood the Nephilim. They were not just destructive beings causing chaos. They were also a symbol of inevitability. Their story was about how corruption cannot last forever, and how even the most powerful beings are subject to divine judgment. The fact that they dream of their end emphasizes this idea. It is as if the giants themselves could sense that their existence was out of balance with creation, and that it would not endure. The Qumran fragments also connect the giant story more directly to human corruption. In addition to violence and consumption, the Nephilim are described as spreading sin among people, teaching forbidden practices, and leading others astray. This echoes the themes of Enoch but sharpens them by placing the giants themselves at the center. In other words, it was not just the Watchers who corrupted humanity by sharing knowledge. The Nephilim carried that corruption forward, multiplying it in their own lives and actions. What makes this text so fascinating is that it was not an isolated tradition. Versions of the Book of Giants were later adapted into the religion of Manichaeism, which spread across the Near East and Central Asia. In those later writings, the giants still represented the consequences of rebellion and desire, and their destruction remained a central theme. The endurance of the story in multiple traditions shows that the Nephilim were not a marginal curiosity, but a central myth used to explain why the world had once been judged so harshly. When we combine the accounts from Genesis, Enoch, and the Book of Giants, we begin to see a fuller picture. The Nephilim were remembered as hybrid beings, the result of forbidden unions between heavenly watchers and human women. They were giants, larger and stronger than ordinary people, but also more violent and corrupt. They consumed resources, spread violence, and introduced practices that led humanity further into sin. They dreamed of their own destruction, and ultimately they could not escape it. The fragments from Qumran are especially important because they show that these ideas were not fringe speculations. They were part of mainstream thought in some Jewish communities around the time of Jesus. People were reading these stories, reflecting on them, and interpreting their meaning. The presence of the text among the Dead Sea Scrolls, alongside biblical books like Isaiah and Deuteronomy, shows that for some groups the story of the Nephilim was essential to understanding why God judged the world with the flood. But what does this mean for us today? For one, it highlights how much ancient people wrestled with questions of boundaries and corruption. The Nephilim were more than giants. They were symbols of what happens when divine order is broken. The fact that their story appears in so many forms, biblical verses, apocryphal books, Qumran scrolls, and even later religious traditions, shows just how deeply this question mattered. The giants were also remembered as a warning. In the Book of Giants, their dreams show that even the most powerful beings cannot escape accountability. Their size and strength did not protect them from judgment, and their parentage did not give them immunity. Instead, their story reinforces the idea that corruption, no matter how mighty, eventually collapses under its own weight. For modern readers, these texts invite us to reflect on how myths and religious stories carry meaning across time. Whether or not we see the Nephilim as literal beings, their story speaks to universal human concerns: the danger of crossing forbidden boundaries, the consequences of unchecked power, and the inevitability of judgment when order is broken. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve these fragments as a reminder that ancient people grappled with these questions in their own ways, using the story of giants to give shape to their fears and their hopes. And yet, even with all of this detail, one thing remains constant: the Nephilim are still shrouded in mystery. We do not know exactly how the ancient writers pictured them, nor do we know how much of their story was meant to be literal, symbolic, or somewhere in between. What we do know is that they were remembered as beings who nearly destroyed the world, and whose very existence required God to intervene with a flood. The Book of Giants may only survive in fragments, but together with Genesis and Enoch, it builds a powerful image of the Nephilim as both real and symbolic threats. Giants whose corruption forced humanity into crisis. Their legacy is one of power, fear, and the reminder that nothing that violates the natural order can last forever. When we think about the Nephilim, it is easy to focus only on their size or their mysterious origins. But the ancient texts tell us that the real danger they posed was not only physical, it was moral and cultural. The Nephilim came to represent a tipping point in which humanity's world was so corrupted that survival itself was at stake. They were remembered not simply as giants who could crush humans in battle, but as figures whose influence and actions eroded the foundations of life on Earth. In the Book of Enoch and the fragments of the Book of Giants, the giants are portrayed as consuming forces. They ate and drank without restraint, exhausting the resources around them. This detail may seem small, but it is powerful when we stop to consider its implications. In the ancient world, survival often depended on fragile balances between land and crops, between herds and pastures, between water and drought. A community that overconsumed could devastate the environment and bring famine upon itself. To describe the Nephilim as devourers of the earth, produce is to picture them as a living symbol of imbalance. They were beings whose appetites knew no limits, and their hunger left little behind for ordinary people. When their food was gone, the stories say, they turned to flesh. This element of the tradition depicts them as crossing another boundary, violating the most basic moral law of creation. Cannibalism and violence against humankind reinforced the idea that they were not just bigger humans, but something alien to the natural order. Their violence spread fear, and in many accounts they ruled through domination rather than cooperation. If the Nephilim were the men of renown, their fame came not from noble deeds but from sheer terror. But the corruption was not only material, it was also spiritual and intellectual. The Watchers, their angelic fathers, had introduced forbidden knowledge to humankind. In Enoch, these teachings included metallurgy, cosmetics, enchantments, and astrology. To the ancient writers, these were not neutral skills. Weapons meant violence. Charms and magic meant manipulation of powers that should remain hidden. Adornments meant vanity and lust. and astrology meant relying on the stars instead of the Creator. The Nephilim inherited this world of corruption and spread it even further. One way to understand this is to see the Nephilim as a story about human temptation. The Watchers did not force people to use weapons or to practice magic, but by revealing these secrets, they gave humanity tools that could easily be misused. In this way, the Nephilim narrative mirrors a pattern that recurs throughout human history. Knowledge without wisdom can lead to disaster. The giants represent the magnified outcome of this imbalance: strength without restraint, appetite without limit, knowledge without responsibility. The effect of the Nephilim on the world, according to these texts, was so devastating that God determined the earth could not continue in its current state. The Genesis account places the story of Noah directly after the mention of the Nephilim, and the link is significant. In that narrative, God sees that the earth is filled with violence and corruption. Humanity's thoughts are continually evil, and the world is beyond repair. The flood is presented as the solution, a way to cleanse creation and start anew. Even if Genesis does not say outright that the Nephilim caused the flood, the sequence of events places them within the context of corruption that demanded judgment. This way of telling the story served a powerful role in the ancient imagination. It explained why such a drastic act as the flood was necessary. It gave a reason why God would choose to wipe out not just individuals, but entire communities and creatures. If the very fabric of life had been disrupted by these hybrid beings, then the flood was not simply punishment, but restoration. It was the resetting of a world thrown into chaos by those who should never have existed in the first place. The Nephilim also became an archetype of unchecked power. Later references in Numbers, where the Israelite spies describe seeing descendants of the Nephilim in Canaan, show how the memory of giants continued to represent overwhelming opposition. The people of Israel, fresh from Egypt, looked at these towering figures and felt small and powerless. The text says they felt like grasshoppers in comparison. Whether these were literal descendants or just the lingering myth of giants, the story reveals how deeply the image of the Nephilim had been burned into memory. To face giants was to face the ultimate symbol of an enemy who could not be overcome by ordinary strength. This sense of overwhelming corruption has also shaped how later traditions interpreted the story. Some saw the Nephilim not only as physical beings, but as a metaphor for human pride, violence, and excess. Others treated them as evidence of a cosmic struggle, a reminder that forces beyond human understanding can disrupt the world. In both cases, their story became a warning. When boundaries are crossed, whether moral, spiritual, or natural, destruction follows. For the ancient audience, the Nephilim narrative carried both fear and explanation. It gave them a way to talk about why the world had once been judged so severely. It allowed them to imagine a reason behind the flood that went beyond ordinary human sin. It turned the Nephilim into a symbol of the dangers of corruption on a scale so great that even creation itself could not bear it. In modern terms, we might say the Nephilim represent the problem of power without responsibility. They are the story of what happens when strength is used for consumption rather than protection, when knowledge is applied for domination rather than wisdom, and when boundaries are ignored in pursuit of desire. The ancients may not have used those words, but the story they told points to the same reality. The moral catastrophe of the Nephilim, then, was not just about giants walking the earth. It was about a vision of the world in which chaos overtakes order, where appetite overwhelms restraint, and where corruption spreads until the only solution is a fresh start. That is why their story remains haunting. It is not only a tale about the past, but a reflection on the dangers that appear whenever humanity forgets its limits. For as long as people have read the short passage in Genesis about the Nephilim, they have argued over what it really means. Were these truly giants, supernatural hybrids born of angels and humans? Or was the story symbolic, a way of speaking about human corruption and violence? The debate has never been settled, and over centuries, scholars, theologians, and ordinary readers have put forward different theories to explain this strange group that appears suddenly in the biblical text. The first and perhaps most dramatic interpretation is the one we have already seen in the book of Enoch, that the sons of God, were angels who descended to earth and took human wives. This angelic interpretation has ancient roots. In the book of Job, the same Hebrew phrase, Bene Elohim, sons of God, clearly refers to angelic beings standing in God's heavenly council. If the same meaning applies in Genesis, then the story points to heavenly beings leaving their proper place and crossing into the human world. The Nephilim, in this view, were the monstrous results of that forbidden crossing. This interpretation was very common in early Judaism and was widely accepted among early Christians as well. Church fathers such as Justin Martyr and Tertullian repeated the Enochic version of the story, treating it as historical. Even the New Testament letter of Jude seems to echo Enoch's language, speaking of angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper dwelling. For many in the ancient world, the idea that the Nephilim were hybrid offspring of fallen angels and humans made sense of the flood story and of the violence that filled the earth. Yet this was not the only interpretation. From very early on, Jewish scholars developed another way of reading Genesis 6. Instead of seeing the sons of God as angels, they saw them as human. More specifically, they saw them as the descendants of Seth, Adam's son who followed the way of God. The daughters of men, in this view, referred to the descendants of Cain, the son who killed his brother Abel, and whose line symbolized rebellion. In this interpretation, the Nephilim were not supernatural giants, but the result of intermarriage between godly and ungodly lines. Their corruption came not from angelic fathers, but from moral compromise. This reading gained popularity because it avoided some difficult theological problems. If angels could marry human women and have children, what did that say about the nature of angels? Were they truly spiritual beings? Or did they have physical bodies? How could such unions even be possible? By interpreting the story as a matter of human families intermingling, those problems disappeared. The story became one of moral decline, not cosmic rebellion. In this sense, the Nephilim symbolized what happens when the faithful compromise with the unfaithful, leading to a collapse of values. There is also a third interpretation, one that sees the sons of God not as angels or as the line of Seth, but as rulers or kings. In the ancient Near East, it was common for kings to claim divine ancestry or to be called sons of gods in inscriptions. From this perspective, Genesis 6 is not describing a supernatural event at all, but rather the arrogance of rulers who exalted themselves and took as many wives as they pleased. The Nephilim, then, were the children of these unions, figures remembered as mighty and renowned, but whose power was oppressive. This political reading fits with the wider biblical theme of critiquing human pride and corruption. It shifts the focus away from angelic rebellion and places it instead on human society, where leaders abused their power and their offspring became symbols of excess. For those who hold this interpretation, the story of the Nephilim is a story of the dangers of tyranny and of human rulers claiming more than what rightly belongs to them. Each of these interpretations, angelic, Sethite, and royal, has its supporters and its critics. The angelic view explains the language of Genesis most directly, but raises troubling questions about the nature of angels. The Sethite view avoids those problems, but it requires a symbolic reading of the terms sons of God and daughters of men. The royal view makes sense in its ancient cultural context, but it downplays the connection to later passages like Numbers, where the Nephilim are described as giants. Beyond these mainstream interpretations, there are also more speculative theories. Some fringe writers have connected the Nephilim to supposed archaeological discoveries of giant skeletons, though such claims have never been verified. Others in the modern era have linked the Nephilim to ancient astronaut theories, suggesting that they were not angels at all but extraterrestrials who visited Earth and interbred with humans. These theories, while popular in some circles, are not supported by historical evidence, but they show how enduring the fascination with the Nephilim has been. Whenever people search for an explanation for the mysterious or the extraordinary, the giants of Genesis often reappear. Scholars today continue to wrestle with the meaning of the word itself. While most agree that it comes from the root meaning to fall, What exactly fallen ones means is less clear. Were they fallen from heaven, fallen in battle, or those who caused others to fall? The fact that the Septuagint translated the word as giants has influenced centuries of interpretation, but the original Hebrew leaves the question open. This ambiguity is perhaps part of why the story has remained so compelling. The Nephilim can be read as literal giants, symbolic figures, or historical rulers, depending on one's perspective. The debates also reveal something about the way people approach texts. For those who prefer to see the Bible in harmony with later tradition, the Enochic version with angels and giants is attractive. For those who seek a more rational or theological explanation, the Sethite view is more acceptable. And for those who look to cultural context, the royal interpretation makes sense. Each reading says as much about the interpreter as it does about the text. What we can say with certainty is that the Nephilim were remembered as extraordinary. Whether they were giants, rulers, or simply figures of renown, they stood out as symbols of a world on the edge of collapse. Their presence in Genesis serves as a marker of the depth of human corruption, a sign that the earth had strayed far from its intended order. In the end, the mystery may be the point. The Nephilim are mentioned only briefly, leaving us with questions rather than answers. Their ambiguity invites reflection, debate, and even imagination. Perhaps that is why they continue to fascinate. They represent the boundary between human and divine, between history and myth, between explanation and mystery. And in that space, people across time have projected their fears, their theories, and their hopes. Over time, the story of the Nephilim moved far beyond the few verses in Genesis and the ancient writings that expanded on them. Their shadow has stretched across cultures and eras, appearing in art, literature, and even modern entertainment. This cultural afterlife of the Nephilim shows just how deeply their mystery resonates, even for people who may not know the details of the biblical or apocryphal texts. When a story refuses to fade, it usually means it touches something universal in human imagination. The Nephilim, as giants who blurred the line between human and divine, became one of those enduring images. In Jewish tradition, especially in the centuries surrounding the Second Temple period, the Nephilim were often connected to themes of judgment and corruption. Communities like those at Qumran, who preserved the Book of Giants and other writings, saw in the Nephilim an explanation for why the world once became so unbalanced that God had to act decisively. For them, the giants were not just figures of curiosity but warnings. They stood for what happens when creation itself is distorted. The continued copying and circulation of these texts show that people felt the story was relevant to their own struggles with questions of morality and purity. Early Christianity inherited this tradition, and in some writings, the Nephilim appear as examples of what happens when spiritual beings abandon their proper place. Church fathers who accepted the Book of Enoch's telling of the story saw the Nephilim as evidence of angelic rebellion, a lesson about the dangers of pride and desire. Others who leaned toward the Sethite interpretation saw them more symbolically as evidence of moral decline when God's people mixed too closely with the ungodly. Either way, the giants functioned as reminders of the dangers of corruption. As centuries passed, the Nephilim did not remain only in religious commentary. In medieval times, giants became common figures in folklore and legend across Europe and the Middle East. While not always identified directly as Nephilim, the idea of ancient giants who once walked the earth became part of the imagination of many cultures. Stories of enormous skeletons supposedly unearthed, or of ancient ruins said to have been built by giants, carried echoes of the biblical account. The Nephilim were not far from people's minds when they encountered the unexplained. In literature, the Nephilim began to appear more explicitly in the modern era. Writers who explored themes of biblical mystery or ancient history often turned to them as dramatic figures. They were used to fill in gaps in the biblical narrative, to provide larger-than-life antagonists, or to serve as metaphors for the blending of worlds that should remain apart. The giants symbolized danger, temptation, and the fragility of humanity in the face of overwhelming power. Their influence grew even stronger in popular culture. In In the 20th and 21st centuries, the Nephilim began to appear in novels, films, television shows, video games, and even music. Sometimes they were depicted as literal giants, descendants of angels, with immense physical power. In other cases, the word Nephilim became shorthand for any being that was part human and part something else, part angel, part demon, or even part alien. The term carried with it an aura of mystery and danger, making it attractive for creators of stories who wanted to draw on something ancient yet flexible. In television shows like Supernatural or Sleepy Hollow, Nephilim are imagined as powerful hybrid beings whose existence changes the balance between good and evil. In fantasy book series such as The Mortal Instruments, they become central characters in a world where angels and demons influence human life. Even in video games like Diablo or Darksiders, the word Nephilim is used to describe mighty warriors who stand between worlds. Each of these reinterpretations takes creative liberties, but they all share the sense that the Nephilim are not ordinary. They are beings defined by crossing boundaries, and in that crossing they gain both power and danger. The fascination also extends into more speculative areas of culture. Ancient astronaut theories, popularized by writers like Erich von Däniken, sometimes claim that the Nephilim were not angels at all, but extraterrestrials who visited Earth in the distant past. According to these theories, their union with humans produced the giants described in Genesis, and their forbidden knowledge was, in fact, advanced technology. While historians and archaeologists dismiss these ideas, they have become widespread in popular documentaries and books. The Nephilim in this context symbolize humanity's enduring curiosity about life beyond our planet and the origins of civilization. Even music has drawn on their image. Bands such as Fields of the Nephilim in the gothic rock genre have used their name to evoke mystery, darkness, and otherworldliness. The giants' reputation for power and corruption has been reshaped into a symbol for the tension between human and divine, between light and shadow. What stands out across all these cultural uses is how adaptable the Nephilim are. In one story, they are monstrous giants. In another, tragic figures doomed by fate. And in another, heroic warriors caught between worlds. This adaptability comes from the ambiguity of the original texts. Because Genesis offers so little detail, later writers and artists have felt free to fill in the gaps with their own imagination. The Nephilim become whatever the storyteller needs them to be: warnings, villains, heroes, or mysteries. At the same time, their persistence in culture shows how deeply the themes of their story resonate. The Nephilim represent the idea of limits crossed, of boundaries broken. They remind us of the dangers of power without restraint, and of knowledge without wisdom. In every retelling, whether in scripture, folklore, or entertainment, they carry with them the weight of corruption and the reminder that such corruption cannot last forever. For the modern audience, the Nephilim are less about explaining why the flood happened and more about exploring questions of identity, power, and destiny. What does it mean to be part human and part something else? What happens when the natural order is disrupted? These are timeless questions, and the Nephilim continue to give shape to them in ways that captivate imagination. Their journey from ancient texts to modern media shows just how powerful a short, mysterious phrase in scripture can become. The Nephilim began as mighty men of old, men of renown, mentioned only briefly, yet their image has become far larger than their biblical footprint. Whether viewed as ancient giants, angelic hybrids, or symbols of corruption, they remain figures that challenge us to think about the dangers of crossing boundaries and the consequences of unchecked desire. So after all the fragments, debates, and traditions, what are we left with? Did the Nephilim nearly destroy humanity? Or were they simply remembered as symbols of corruption in a world that had already lost its balance? The answer depends on which path we follow through the evidence. But one thing is clear: their presence in the ancient imagination carried extraordinary weight. If we read them through Genesis alone, they appear as a mysterious introduction to the flood narrative. They are on the earth in those days, and also afterward, described as mighty men, men of renown. Their presence is linked by placement if not directly by cause, to the judgment that follows. In this way, the Nephilim become a narrative marker, a sign that the world of Noah's time had reached its breaking point. They did not necessarily swing the sword that destroyed humanity, but their existence embodied the imbalance that made destruction inevitable. If we follow the book of Enoch, the picture becomes much sharper. There, the Nephilim are giants of violence and appetite, devouring the earth's resources and turning to human flesh when nothing else was left. Their fathers, the Watchers, gave humanity knowledge that disrupted the order of life. Together, they transformed creation into a place so corrupted that the flood was not only judgment, but the only possible reset. In this telling, the Nephilim nearly destroyed humanity by sheer force of presence. Their hunger, their violence, their corruption left the earth unlivable. The Book of Giants adds another layer. Here, the giants are not only destroyers, but dreamers. They see visions of their own end, foreshadowing the flood. Their dreams are interpreted as signs that the world they helped create cannot continue. In this way, the Nephilim are both cause and symptom, agents of destruction, and at the same time symbols of inevitability. The text suggests that once such beings existed, judgment was unavoidable. Modern scholarship offers other perspectives. Some argue that the Nephilim were not supernatural at all, but instead, legendary warriors or rulers whose power and cruelty earned them the title Fallen Ones. In this interpretation, the Nephilim destroyed humanity not by size or appetite, but by domination, by ruling through fear and violence. Their legacy was not cosmic corruption, but social oppression. What all these views share is the idea that the Nephilim stood for a world turned upside down. Whether giants, hybrids, kings, or symbols, they represent the collapse of boundaries between heaven and earth, morality and desire, order and chaos. They remind us that when boundaries are crossed without restraint, destruction follows. The flood, in this sense, becomes more than just an ancient story of judgment. It becomes a reflection on what happens when corruption spreads unchecked. The legacy of the Nephilim is therefore not only about what they were, but about what they meant. They were remembered as beings who nearly destroyed humanity, but more importantly, as a warning about what happens when the balance of life is broken. Their story asked ancient listeners to reflect on their own choices, their own limits, their own temptations, and it continues to ask us the same today. The fact that their story has survived in so many forms, biblical texts, apocryphal writings, Dead Sea fragments, folklore, and modern media, shows that it carries themes too important to forget. Every generation has found in the Nephilim a way to talk about power, corruption, and boundaries. They may look different depending on the context, sometimes monstrous giants, sometimes tragic hybrids, sometimes rulers of old. But at their core, they embody the same truth, that humanity can be threatened not only by natural disaster or external enemies, but by the consequences of crossing limits that were never meant to be crossed. And so the question remains, did the Nephilim nearly destroy humanity? For the communities who preserved these stories, the answer was yes. In one way or another, their presence brought the world to the brink of collapse. But perhaps the deeper lesson is not whether they were literal giants or mythic symbols. The lesson is that the world itself can be undone by corruption, whether through violence, greed, misuse of knowledge, or the arrogance of power. The Nephilim stand as a reminder of that truth, carved into ancient memory. Today, their story continues to spark curiosity, debate, and even creativity. They may not walk among us as towering beings, but they still shape how we think about the dangers of unchecked desire and power. In that sense, their legacy lives on. The giants may have fallen, but their story has not.